The neighborhood had always sold itself as quiet, orderly, and civilized, the kind of place where trimmed hedges and neutral paint colors were treated like moral virtues. The HOA brochures promised harmony, rising property values, and a sense of community. For years, that illusion mostly held. Rules existed, fines were rare, and the board operated in the background like an unseen referee. That balance shattered the moment a $50 fine appeared in the homeowner's mailbox. The notice arrived folded crisply, printed in bold ink, and sealed with the HOA's logo like a warning stamp. It cited a landscaping violation, vague and poorly documented, claiming a section of grass near the curb had grown beyond acceptable length. No measurements were provided, no photos attached, no prior warnings issued. Just $50 due within 14 days, with a reminder that unpaid fines could escalate. At first, it seemed petty but harmless. $50 was irritating, but it wasn't worth a fight. Still, something about the notice felt off. The grass in question had been cut days earlier. The property had passed city inspections without issue. The homeowner had lived there long enough to know when rules were being bent versus when they were being weaponized. Instead of paying immediately, the homeowner requested clarification through the HOA's official channels. That simple request triggered an unexpected reaction. Within days, a second notice arrived, this time carrying a colder tone. The fine was still $50, but now it included vague language about repeated noncompliance, administrative fees, and the HOA's authority to enforce penalties. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. What should have been a routine correction was turning into something more aggressive. The homeowner began paying closer attention to the HOA's behavior, reviewing old emails, archived notices, and community updates. Patterns started emerging. Other residents had received similar fines over minor issues. Some had paid immediately to avoid trouble. Others had complained quietly, only to face escalating pressure. Then came the third notice. This one mentioned liens. The document referenced the HOA's right to place a lien on the property for unpaid fines, interest, and legal fees. It cited bylaws without context and statutes without explanation. The $50 fine now loomed larger, wrapped in threats that felt disproportionate and deliberate. The homeowner realized this was no longer about grass or compliance. It was about control. The HOA board had recently changed. Longtime members had resigned quietly, replaced by individuals eager to assert authority. Enforcement had become stricter, communication more hostile. Notices were no longer friendly reminders but formal warnings. The board's tone suggested that resistance would be punished, not discussed. Rather than backing down, the homeowner decided to document everything. Every notice was scanned and archived. Envelopes were saved. Dates were logged. HOA bylaws were downloaded and printed. State statutes governing homeowners associations were researched late into the night. What started as mild annoyance evolved into a methodical review of the HOA's legal footing. The deeper the homeowner looked, the shakier that footing appeared. The bylaws contained contradictions. Procedures for issuing fines were inconsistent with state law. Requirements for notice and hearings were either vague or outright ignored. The lien language, which the HOA wielded so confidently, was far more limited than the notices implied. It became clear that the board relied heavily on intimidation, assuming most homeowners wouldn't challenge them. Another letter arrived before the 14-day deadline expired. This one added an administrative processing fee for failure to remit payment promptly, even though the deadline had not passed. The amount increased not significantly, but symbolically. The message was clear. Delay would be punished. Questioning authority would cost money. The homeowner recognized the tactic instantly. Escalate pressure, inflate fear, and force compliance before anyone has time to think. Instead of responding emotionally, the homeowner slowed down. A formal written request was sent asking for evidence of the violation, the exact bylaw allegedly broken, and documentation of the board's vote authorizing the fine. The request was polite, precise, and carefully worded. The HOA did not respond. Days passed. Then another notice arrived, claiming the homeowner had failed to cooperate. The fine amount was unchanged, but the language had grown sharper. References to legal action were no longer hypothetical. The HOA framed itself as patient but firm, as though it were granting leniency while preparing for escalation. At this point, the homeowner understood something critical. The HOA was not interested in resolving a dispute. It was testing boundaries, probing for weakness, and asserting dominance through bureaucratic aggression. The $50 fine was a pretext. That realization changed everything. Instead of asking for mercy or compromise, the homeowner began preparing for resistance. A detailed timeline was created, documenting every interaction. Copies of state laws were highlighted, particularly those governing fines, notice requirements, and lien authority. Previous HOA newsletters were reviewed, revealing inconsistencies in enforcement. Other homeowners were quietly contacted, not to rally support yet, but to compare experiences. What emerged was a troubling picture. Multiple residents had been fined without proper notice. Hearings were rarely offered. Appeals were discouraged. Some homeowners had paid hundreds of dollars in accumulated penalties simply to make the problem go away. A few had sold their homes to escape the stress entirely. The HOA's behavior wasn't accidental. It was systematic. Then came the letter that crossed the line. The HOA formally threatened to begin the lien process if the outstanding balance was not paid within 7 days. The amount was still under $100, but the implications were severe. A lien could impact refinancing, selling the home, or even lead to foreclosure if left unchecked. The threat was wildly disproportionate, but that was the point. Fear was the weapon. The homeowner felt anger, but also clarity. The HOA had made a mistake. It had escalated too fast, left too many paper trails, and underestimated the person on the receiving end. This was no longer a dispute over landscaping. It was an opportunity to expose a system that relied on bullying and legal ignorance. The homeowner did not pay the fine. Instead, certified letters were prepared. Formal records requests were drafted. Complaints were outlined, not yet filed, but ready. Every step was calculated. The goal was no longer to avoid a $50 charge. The goal was to hold the HOA accountable using its own rules and the laws it claimed to enforce. As the 7-day deadline approached, the homeowner remained silent publicly and active privately. The HOA interpreted the silence as surrender or negligence. Internally, the board prepared to escalate further, confident that the threat of a lien would finally break resistance. They had no idea that the homeowner was already several steps ahead. The stage was set for a confrontation far larger than anyone on the HOA board anticipated. What began as a trivial fine had evolved into a challenge that would test the limits of the HOA's authority, drain its resources, and expose its leadership. And as the deadline expired, the first real move was about to be made, one that would transform a $50 dispute into a financial and legal nightmare for the HOA. The moment the deadline passed, the HOA acted exactly as expected. Another notice arrived, heavier in tone and thicker in content. It confirmed the board's intent to proceed with lien-related actions, cited additional administrative fees, and warned of legal escalation. The language was confident, almost smug, as if the board believed the homeowner had finally been cornered. What the HOA didn't realize was that every move they made was being cataloged, cross-referenced, and measured against the law. The homeowner began by filing formal records requests. State law required HOAs to produce documentation upon request, including meeting minutes, voting records, enforcement logs, and financial statements. The requests were precise and extensive, covering months of board activity related to fines, liens, and enforcement procedures. They were sent certified, tracked, and impossible to ignore. The HOA responded slowly and incompletely. Meeting minutes were vague. Votes were summarized but not detailed. Some documents were missing entirely. Financial records were provided in fragments, revealing unexplained legal expenses and a growing reliance on the HOA's attorney. The more documents arrived, the clearer the pattern became. The board was operating loosely, often bypassing formal votes and delegating enforcement decisions to one or two dominant personalities. Those personalities became visible in the paperwork. Certain board members appeared repeatedly in email chains, approving fines unilaterally, authorizing legal threats without full board consent, and communicating with the HOA's law firm outside of recorded meetings. The bylaws required collective decisions for enforcement actions, but the records suggested otherwise. Armed with this information, the homeowner escalated strategically. A formal demand letter was prepared, outlining the HOA's procedural failures in meticulous detail. It cited specific sections of state law, referenced missing documentation, and highlighted inconsistencies between the bylaws and the HOA's actions. The letter didn't threaten immediately. It requested compliance, correction, and a halt to lien proceedings until proper procedures were followed. The HOA interpreted the letter as an act of defiance. Instead of de-escalating, the board doubled down. They forwarded the matter to their attorney, authorizing further legal action. More fees were added to the homeowner's account. The amount now exceeded several $100s, not because of the original fine, but because of administrative and legal costs imposed unilaterally. That decision marked the turning point. By involving their attorney prematurely and without proper authorization, the HOA triggered a cascade of expenses they didn't fully understand. Each letter from the attorney cost the HOA money. Each consultation drained the legal fund. Meanwhile, the homeowner responded carefully, forcing the attorney to research, justify, and defend actions that were increasingly indefensible. Every response from the homeowner was deliberate and documented. Questions were raised about the validity of the fine, the authority to impose fees, and the legality of lien threats without hearings. The attorney, obligated to respond, had to dig deeper into the HOA's records, uncovering flaws the board had glossed over. The HOA's legal fund began shrinking. Meanwhile, the homeowner expanded the scope of scrutiny. A complaint was filed with the state agency overseeing HOAs, outlining procedural violations and providing supporting documentation. Another complaint was prepared for the state's Consumer Protection Office, alleging deceptive practices and intimidation. The complaints weren't dramatic or emotional. They were clinical, factual, and backed by evidence. The HOA was notified of these filings as required. The tone of their communications changed almost overnight. Notices became less aggressive. Deadlines were softened. References to liens grew more cautious. The board realized, too late, that the homeowner wasn't bluffing. Behind the scenes, tensions exploded. Board members began questioning each other's decisions. Emails leaked through records requests showed frustration and blame shifting. Some members argued that the $50 fine should have been dropped early on. Others insisted on pushing forward to avoid appearing weak. The HOA's attorney, sensing liability, advised more conservative actions, but by then the damage was done. The homeowner continued pressing forward. Another records request demanded proof that proper hearings had been offered before fines were issued, not just to the homeowner but to others as well. The HOA struggled to respond. In many cases, hearings had never occurred. Notices had been sent, but procedural steps had been skipped entirely. This revelation was explosive. Under state law, fines issued without proper hearings were unenforceable. Fees added on top of invalid fines were equally invalid. Worse, threatening liens based on those fines exposed the HOA to legal consequences. The homeowner compiled everything into a comprehensive dossier. The original $50 fine was now almost irrelevant. The focus had shifted to systemic abuse of power. The dossier detailed patterns of intimidation, procedural shortcuts, and financial mismanagement. It included timelines, annotated documents, and references to statutory violations. The HOA's attorney requested a private conference. The homeowner declined. Instead, another formal letter was sent, this one demanding the immediate removal of all fines and fees, reimbursement for costs incurred, and written confirmation that lien proceedings had been terminated. It also warned that failure to comply would result in further regulatory complaints and potential litigation. The HOA hesitated. They attempted a partial concession, offering to waive some fees while maintaining the original fine. The homeowner rejected the offer, pointing out that partial fixes did not address the underlying violations. At this stage, the HOA's legal expenses had ballooned. Thousands of dollars had been spent responding to records requests, drafting letters, and consulting with counsel. The legal fund, designed for rare disputes, was being drained by a fight over $50. Word spread quietly through the neighborhood. Other homeowners began requesting records of their own. Some questioned past fines. Others demanded hearings retroactively. The HOA's administrative burden increased dramatically. Each request required time, legal review, and response. The board, once confident and assertive, now appeared overwhelmed. Internal fractures deepened. One board member resigned abruptly, citing personal reasons. Another stopped attending meetings. Emails revealed growing fear about personal liability and potential lawsuits. The HOA's authority, once unquestioned, was visibly eroding. The homeowner remained methodical, never gloating, never rushing. Every move forced the HOA to spend more money, expend more energy, and expose more flaws. The strategy wasn't revenge in the traditional sense. It was accountability through endurance. By the time the HOA realized the scale of the problem, it was too late to retreat cleanly. The legal fund was nearly exhausted. Regulatory agencies were asking questions. Homeowners were watching closely. The $50 fine had transformed into a financial sinkhole. As the HOA scrambled to contain the damage, the homeowner prepared the final phase. The groundwork had been laid. The evidence was overwhelming. The next step would force the HOA to confront not just one homeowner, but the consequences of years of unchecked power. And when that confrontation arrived, it would cost them far more than money. By the time the HOA understood the scope of the crisis, the narrative had already slipped out of their control. What had once been framed as a routine enforcement action now stood exposed as a pattern of overreach, mismanagement, and intimidation. The homeowner had done nothing dramatic or impulsive. The damage came from persistence, documentation, and an unrelenting focus on procedure. The HOA's legal fund was effectively depleted. Monthly financial statements, obtained through ongoing records requests, showed the numbers clearly. Legal expenses had surged far beyond projections. Funds earmarked for maintenance and community projects had been quietly redirected to cover attorney fees. The board attempted to downplay the issue in community updates, but the absence of planned improvements spoke louder than any reassurance. Regulatory agencies began responding. The state HOA Oversight Office acknowledged the complaint and requested additional documentation from the board. The Consumer Protection Agency followed up with questions regarding enforcement practices and homeowner communications. Each inquiry required a formal response, reviewed by legal counsel, adding to the HOA's mounting costs. The board was now operating defensively. Meetings became longer and more frequent. Agendas were packed with legal discussions rather than community matters. The tone shifted from authority to anxiety. Emails circulated internally about potential personal liability and the need for insurance coverage reviews. Board members, once eager to assert control, now worried about being named individually in future actions. The homeowner continued calmly. A final demand was submitted, summarizing the findings and offering a clear resolution path. All fines and fees were to be rescinded. Written confirmation of compliance with state law was required. The homeowner also requested reimbursement for documented costs incurred during the dispute. The demand was firm but measured, grounded entirely in evidence already provided. The HOA attempted one last maneuver. They proposed mediation, framing it as a cooperative solution. The offer came with conditions, including confidentiality and a partial waiver of claims. The homeowner declined, recognizing it as an attempt to contain fallout rather than address wrongdoing. Accepting mediation would have shielded the board from accountability. Pressure mounted from within the community. Other homeowners, emboldened by the unfolding situation, began questioning past enforcement actions publicly. Some requested refunds for fines they believed were improperly issued. Others demanded transparency in board decisions and finances. Attendance at meetings surged. The board, once insulated by apathy, now faced scrutiny from all sides. Resignations followed. The board member most closely associated with enforcement stepped down first, citing stress and personal reasons. Another resigned weeks later, acknowledging disagreements over how the situation had been handled. Their departures were quiet but telling. Authority was fracturing. With the board weakened, the HOA's attorney shifted strategy. Communications became conciliatory. Language softened. The homeowner received confirmation that lien proceedings had been halted indefinitely. Shortly after, another letter arrived rescinding all fines and fees related to the original notice. The $50 fine, the administrative charges, and the legal add-ons vanished with no admission of fault. It wasn't enough. The homeowner pressed forward, submitting the documentation of rescinded fines to regulatory agencies as proof that enforcement had been improper. The agencies continued their reviews, now focusing on broader governance issues rather than a single dispute. The HOA's insurance carrier became involved. Concerns about potential claims triggered a policy review. Premiums increased. Coverage limitations were imposed. The board was advised to minimize legal exposure, further constraining their actions. Financial strain deepened, not through a single judgment, but through cumulative consequences. Eventually, the HOA conceded fully. A formal notice was sent to all homeowners announcing changes to enforcement procedures. New policies emphasized due process, hearings, and transparency. The language was carefully crafted, but the subtext was clear. The old way was over. The homeowner received reimbursement for documented costs, along with written confirmation that no violations remained on record. The lien threat was officially withdrawn, acknowledged as premature. In total, the HOA had spent more than $50,000. The figure wasn't announced publicly, but it was visible in budget reports and deferred projects. Legal fees, administrative costs, insurance adjustments, and regulatory compliance expenses had accumulated steadily. All of it traced back to a $50 fine that never should have existed. The aftermath reshaped the community. A special election brought in new board members focused on rebuilding trust. Meetings became more transparent. Enforcement slowed dramatically. Homeowners felt safer questioning decisions without fear of retaliation. The culture shifted from compliance through fear to governance through accountability. The homeowner did not celebrate loudly. There was no victory lap, no public shaming. The satisfaction came from knowing that the system had been forced to correct itself. Power had been checked not through aggression, but through persistence and knowledge. The story spread quietly, then widely. Other communities heard about what had happened. Homeowners learned that HOAs were not untouchable. Fines could be challenged. Threats could be questioned. The fear that kept many silent began to fade. All of it started with $50. A small, unjust fine became the catalyst for exposing an entire structure built on intimidation. The HOA had tried to assert dominance through liens and threats. Instead, they revealed their own weaknesses and paid the price. In the end, no courtroom verdict was needed. No dramatic confrontation took place. The consequences unfolded slowly, methodically, and inevitably. The homeowner remained in the house, the lawn trimmed as it always had been, and the HOA learned a lesson it could never forget.